Welcome back, everybody. Last week we finished a series that we were doing about the idea of God being our shelter, right? And what it means to find refuge in God. It was a great series, and I invite you to go back to our website, look through our archives if you want to catch up with that. And next week we're actually going to start a new series that we're going to be looking specifically at the themes of race and racism and what the Bible says about that and how the church should respond to what's going on in the world right now. And, I think that everything that's going on, it's been weighing heavy on all of our minds. And maybe you're thinking, what should I do? How should we react? And we want to take a look at that in depth. So we're going to take a few weeks to go through that. I have a few friends that are going to be joining us for that series of guest speakers. I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be important for our church. And I can't wait for next week to delve into that. But before we get there, there's a topic that's been on my mind the last couple of weeks that I want to address, maybe as just a standalone sermon this morning before we jump into that series. And it's this rough idea, and bear with me, and I kind of try to elaborate it, that I feel like the times in which we're living right now require a very specific way of engaging them and thinking and living, okay? And I'm not necessarily talking right now about the conversation about race. That we'll look at that next week. I'm talking more about this idea that, we've kind of emerging out of 2 months of lockdown, but we're not fully going back to how things were before, right? So we're on lockdown from April 1st to May 29th. So that's 2 months. Our church and most churches in DC at least stopped meeting halfway through March. It's 2.5 months that most of us have been staying at home for the most part. And at the beginning of that lockdown, we went hard, right? We weren't seeing anybody, fully social distancing, isolating, and we were really trying to do as much as we could online. We were on Zoom call after Zoom call. We were having Zoom for work, and we were having Zoom for happy hour, and we were having Zoom for birthday parties and trivia nights, all sorts of stuff. And if you're like me, what happened is that 3-4 weeks into that, we hate that dreaded platform that we get to see people through a screen. And we kind of are so checked out of being on Zoom for any longer than we absolutely have to. And part of what happened is that so many of these initial rhythms that we had built, we kind of let them go a little bit because it was just really hard to just keep up with everything that was going on and all the restrictions. And now we're kind of we went to phase 1 of reopening, and now we're on phase 2, and some restaurants are kind of starting to offer indoor dining. But if we're honest, this doesn't feel like how things were before COVID, right? We're not really going back to how things were before this thing. Hey, I've heard the phrase the new normal, and I want to ban it. I hate it just as much as I hate the phrase unprecedented. We shouldn't use those words anymore. But part of the reason why I hate it is because it's not normal. There's nothing normal about this time. We're walking around, everybody's wearing masks, and you only have certain limits of size. There's all these restrictions that are happening. And a lot of us kind of struggle entering into that space. Maybe you can't wait for things to get back to how they were before. Or maybe you're worried, maybe because COVID is very much still around, and you're not ready to kind of re-enter some public spaces and be around a lot of people. And we find ourselves in this kind of a liminal space where it's hard to figure out how to interact with the world. I would argue that there's a same dynamic happening inside of us. That we've reached this point in this process that the whole world has gone through, that a few of us have begun to kind of checked out emotionally, mentally, or maybe even spiritually from this time, because we've just been kind of going on survival mode for so long. And now that things are beginning to reopen, we realize it's not how it was before. It's not the ideal circumstances. So we kind of just start going through the motions. And that may be with your family, that may be with your work, that may be even be in your relationship with God. Right? And it's this very weird space that we're in, right? We just went this traumatic global event that affected every aspect of our lives and affected literally almost everybody in the whole world. And now we're trying to struggle how to almost rebuild a society in the midst of all the restrictions that exist because, COVID is still a part of our life and a part of our reality. And this is the thing. I think that the Bible actually talks about how to live in times like this. In times where, like, we've left a reality and gone through this traumatic event, and now we find ourselves in this new reality that it's not how things were before, and we don't know how to live our lives, how to rebuild our lives in a time like that. The passage that we read before the sermon this morning, it's actually about that dynamic. Jeremiah 29 contains this letter that the prophet Jeremiah writes to the Jewish exiles that are living in Babylon. Now, to give you a little background, in the year 597 BC, the Babylonian Empire comes and attacks Jerusalem. And it doesn't destroy the city yet, but it takes prisoners and into exile most of the important people in the city. The king, the queen, the princess, all of the influential people in the city. 10,000 people in total are taken from Jerusalem to Babylon as exiles. They only live in Jerusalem, the poorest of the poor. And actually, if you want to read the story, you can go to 2 Kings chapter 24, kind of like verse 8 to 17. You can read, the story of that Jeremiah is referencing to in this passage. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet, and he's left behind in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, there's this debate about what's going to happen and how they should engage this time. Because Jeremiah has actually been prophesying for years that this is going to happen. And he's been warning them, and he's saying, you are oppressing the poor, and you're turning your back on the laws of God, and God is going to withdraw his hand of protection, and there's this Babylonian empire that's taking over the whole world, and they're going to come, and they're going to, siege Jerusalem and take you prisoners. Jeremiah has been warning them that this is happening, right? But part of the warning that he says is that they are going to be in exile for 70 years. Before they're able to go back to Jerusalem. And then when the thing that he's been prophesying actually happens, it's so traumatic for everybody involved, right? Imagine your city comes, it's attacked, and 10,000 people are taken as exiles. It's so dramatic that the majority of the people refuse to accept that this could possibly be true. So if you actually go through the earlier chapters in Jeremiah, you're going to see that there's this other prophet called Hananiah who's actually saying, relax. This is going to be over in 2 years, and God is going to take everybody out from exile, and we're going to be fine. And the story gets super intense because Jeremiah comes to Hananiah and tells him, you're prophesying false stuff. You're lying to these people. It's fake news what you're telling them. And he says, and God's going to judge you for that, and you're actually going to die. And in the story, he dies by the end of that year of him giving this prophecy. Now, somehow, the prophecies of Hananiah and other prophets of the time that were saying, you know what, this is going to be over really soon, really quick, get to the people that are living in exile in Babylon. Now, the people who are living in exile in Babylon are in this very awkward place, right? Because on one side, they are in this state of not knowing how to live there. They're exiles, right? And they're hearing these news that say, hey, listen, just hang on for a little bit longer, couple years, and God is going to do something, and he's going to send you back to Jerusalem, and you're going to be fine. Now, on the other hand of that, they're also in this constant state of mourning because of what they just went through. They were living their lives, and their lives were normal, and this army came and attacked their city and took them away. So some of the Bible scholars say that they were probably all spending the majority of their time kind of living almost outside of the city, by the city gates, just being together, not wanting to engage with the people of Babylon, and just mourning and weeping and experiencing anger and pain because of what had happened to them. There's actually a psalm that describes how they were feeling. It's Psalm 137. I'll read you verses 1 to 6. It says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remember Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. What's going on in this passage is that basically the people of Jerusalem that are in exile in Babylon, they're kind of like suspended in time. They've undergone this incredibly traumatic event, and they're in Babylon, but they're not really there. They're like checked out. And all they can feel is sadness and bitterness and anger because of what's happened. So the psalm is basically saying, how can anybody possibly expect us to move on? How can anybody possibly expect us to like sing songs of joy right now? Like after what's happened to us, all we can do is just long for Jerusalem, long to go back there. Now, I don't blame them. Like I would feel the same way. You would feel the same way if you were, going about your business in your city and this foreign army came and took you as a prisoner into exile to Babylon. All you would be thinking about is wanting to go back home, right? If a global pandemic were to hit the whole world and you had to basically live in lockdown for 2 months and it disrupted every element of your life and you couldn't see really that many people and you had to do everything online and you missed out on events that were important to you and maybe you got sick or maybe somebody that you love got sick or maybe even worse, you lost somebody that you love. This is a traumatic thing that happens. And it's incredibly hard to just move on from that thing. And it affects our lives in all of those deep, profound ways. And maybe sometimes we're like all looking around. We just went through this thing. How can anybody expect us to just go back to living life as normal, right? The thing is, what happens when normal isn't coming back? Well, when this state of things, it's just how life is going to be for the foreseeable future. As much as I hate the term the new normal, there's something to it. Like we don't know how long things are going to be the way they are right now. And into that situation is that the prophet Jeremiah speaks to these people that are in exile that just feel like they can't move on and they're just going to be like in this state of mourning forever. And this is what he says to them. And I just want to reread you a few of the verses of the passage of Jeremiah 29. This is chapter 29, verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. Because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. You've probably heard this passage before, like verses 5 to 7 are kind of like this very famous passage, particularly for churches in the city. Like when we started Encounter, we talked about this passage a lot because it's this vision of how, the people of God engage the cities in which they live. And you've probably heard Jeremiah 29:11, thousands of times, probably one of the most quoted verses of the Old Testament because it's, so full of promise, right? Like, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. Is this verse just filled with so much possibility? And today I don't want to talk about either of these like individually, but I kind of want to show you like an overview of what the whole thing means together, right? Because it's a letter that, God writes to the people of Jerusalem that are in exile through Jeremiah. And imagine, how the people of Jerusalem feel at the time, right? Like they're they're in exile and they're spending most of their time, outside the city gates, just mourning this way of life that they have lost. And to that, God speaks. But it's not comforting in the way you would think, right? Because God doesn't say, hey, it's okay. I'm sorry for what happened. And God also doesn't say, hey, listen, I got you. I'm going to come through for you and do a miracle. And tomorrow or like next week, your life is going back to the way it was before. Instead, God says, look, actually, listen, things are going to be this way for a while. 7 years, actually. And if you're expecting things to go back to normal right away, you're just going to be disappointed. But that's not the only thing God says. Because then God kind of like makes him this promise and helps him see, listen, even though you're in exile, and that hurts, it's difficult, and even though you cannot go back to the way things were before, you can still build a life in the midst of exile. You go through that passage, look at the things that he says. He says, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, have children, have your kids, marry and have more kids and increase in numbers. Like all of the things that God describes in that passage, they're about building a flourishing life. These people in the midst of exile, the last thing they're thinking about is living a flourishing life. And God says, you can actually live a flourishing life. Not only that, you can build a flourishing life and you can help other people flourish. Because then God kind of like shifts the focus of the passage outward. And it says, not only like, I want you to prosper and do this, I want you to seek the prosperity of the place that you're in. Which, think about it, these are the people that have taken them into exile. These are not nice people. They have every right to be bitter and angry and hate them. And yet God says, no, I want you to seek their prosperity, to seek their peace. And then he says, and as they prosper, you too are going to prosper. God says, you not only can live a flourishing life, you can help the lives of others flourish as well. Now, what can this possibly have to do with us? Well, can you see how it relates to us? Because I would argue that these last couple months, it's not the same thing as being carried into exile to Babylon, but they have felt kind of like an exile, haven't they? Right? We're like most of us locked in our homes and every aspect of our life, changed and altered. And now we're in this place that, we're not home yet, right? We're not at the place where things were before. Things are still, different now, and until there is a cure, a treatment, things are going to be different for a little while longer, maybe indefinitely longer. And what concerns me is this, that living a flourishing life, the types of things that we were talking here at Encounter before this happened, seeking God, building a rule of life, reading the scriptures, that takes intentionality. Building a robust spirituality takes intentionality. Building good relationships with the people that you love, with your family, with your friends, that takes intentionality. Growing in your career, all of the things that lead to living a flourishing life, they just don't happen. We have to kind of like lean into them. And that's under normal circumstances because of all the distractions that exist. Now, we're in nothing but normal circumstances, right? There's nothing normal or ideal about the time in which we live. And what I've noticed, particularly in my life, and honestly in other people's life as well, is that we kind of like slide into this, almost like a sense of apathy, where we're just going through the motions. And I don't blame you. We're tired. We're exhausted of the past 2 months, of all the things I've had to change. We need a vacation. We need a break. We need a sabbatical. And yet life keeps coming at us, And I feel like at the beginning, we were all embracing the idea we're in a crisis. And we're like, let's just get through the day. Let's stay alive. Like that was like the motto, right? And whatever response we had, it was okay. Like it was difficult times. And listen, I experienced that because for me, it was like I was trying to figure out how to do, church online for us and keep us connected to one another. And we found out that Megan was pregnant. I was still going to school. Like I was trying to juggle all those things. And I, was barely making it through the day. And what I noticed happened for me is that when the opening plans were released, and we're kind of, okay, there's going to be, phase 1 and phase 2. And I start seeing kind of like all of the different requirements that, we can be together, we can't sing, and like we have to stay 6 feet apart, and we have to wear masks inside in our worship services. I realized, okay, this is not what it was before. We're into this new space. And honestly, it was like a little discouraging for me. Like I almost feel like I would rather like lead in full crisis mode because there's like an adrenaline, rush that happens when you're in that time. Or I would rather like lead in like normal times. But this in between, it's actually harder in a way. And then I thought about this passage, And what I found in this passage was not necessarily the comfort I was looking for. I wanted God to pat me in the back and tell me that it was going to be okay, that everything was going to get fixed the next day. But that's not what I found. I actually found something better than that. What I found is the hope that in the midst of whatever circumstance we find ourselves in, we can not only survive, we can thrive. Verse 11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." I've heard tons of sermons about this passage because it's like so encouraging, right? So people are like, God has plans for you. The best sermons I've heard kind of like, make the point that this is said after God has said, you're going to be in exile for 70 years. And the point they're trying to make is like, it's not just this blanket statement about prosperity. It's this idea that even in the midst of difficult circumstances and situations, after that, God still has plans for us. And I agree with it. I think that's a good reading of the text. But as I was preparing for this talk and I'm reading through it, I get to think, what if what the text is saying, it's not only that after the 70 years of exile, God has plans for a hope and a future, but during the exile, God has plans for his people for a hope and a future. What God is saying is like, listen, in the midst of the situation that you are, where you've lost everything, where everything is upside down and everything is so disoriented there, your life can flourish. And I think that can be true of our time as well. Because, listen, the difficulties that we've experienced, the pain that we've experienced, the loss that we've experienced, they're all, very legitimate and they shouldn't have happened. And yet, here we are. And it's okay for us to mourn that. And some of you, maybe the number one feeling that you have is just frustration and anger. And just like, the sense of not being able to do anything about the situation that's going on. And that's fine. But let me ask you this. Most people are saying that it's going to take 18 months to find some sort of cure. What happens if there's no cure after 18 months? What happens if there's no cure after 2 years? What happens if there's never a cure? What if our lives have changed permanently in certain ways that we haven't even fully begun to realize? And that the world where we had, we're not going to be able to go back anytime soon, or maybe fully be able to go back ever. What do we do then? And I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty, because I really think that all of us are doing the best we can right now. But what I'm saying is this. First of all, we cannot live in crisis mode forever. Like, our adrenaline will run out. Like, a lot of us, that's what happened. We hit this wall and we're done with like online everything because it was just too much. But also, if life goes on, even in the midst of what's happened, if we want to have flourishing lives, if we want to have a flourishing spirituality, if we want to have a flourishing marriage, if we want to have a flourishing relationship with our children, a flourishing career, we cannot wait for things to go back to normal in order to live our lives with intentionality. We cannot live checked out of things indefinitely. And what we see in this passage is a guy saying, you don't have to. There is a hope and a future for us, even in the midst of exile. God hasn't abandoned us. Now, what does that look like? Number one, I would say, is that we have to accept reality in its own terms. And what I mean by that is that, I've talked to some people and I have conversations about what's going on. And I feel like there's kind of like two camps, right? One is we cannot wait for this to be over and be back to how things were before. And the other camp is just angry and bitter about what's happened and all the things that it's caused them or has lost of all that, maybe you have frustrations with your work. Maybe you have frustrations with the government, with how the situation has handled. Maybe you have frustrations with the school system because of how they've handled things. And it's only that. That's the main feeling and the main sense of just, this is wrong. And it just makes me frustrated and angry. And I think that both are legitimate things. I think that there's things that require mourning. And I think that it's not bad to long for things to go back to how they were before. But that's not where we are. We are where we are. We're here. And in order for us to be able to start building a flourishing life here, we have to realize we're here. And the majority of our energy cannot be just, feeling angry or sad or complaining. And it can also not just be wishing for things to come back to normal. This is where we are, and this is the time that requires our focus and our energy and our attention. Now the second thing is that we have to realize that, just because things aren't what they ought to be, it doesn't mean that we cannot build a life under the current circumstances. A few years ago, I watched a movie called Defiance. I don't know if you've ever watched it with Daniel Craig. And at the time I watched the movie, I didn't realize it was a true story. It's based on the story of the Bielski partisans. And the Bielski partisans, it's this group of brothers that during World War II in Poland, they kind of escaped the Nazi army and basically hid in the forest with a group of people from their town that then started growing. And they basically became almost like this insurgent militia that was fighting back the Nazis. But the fascinating part of the story is that they kind of build their own life in there and built their own society during the time that they were in the forest. And they had education and they had agriculture and they had all these things that they needed to just build a life. And then when I started kind of going in the rabbit hole online, reading about this, I found out that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were, number of these, partisan groups all over, the forest in Poland, kind of hiding out and fighting back the Nazi army, but also building some semblance of life in the midst of what was probably one of the most disorienting and traumatic and life-altering events in history. Even in those cases, life goes on and life can be rebuilt. And it might not look like the life we had before, but that doesn't make it any less legitimate. Listen, one of the things that has really warmed my heart is seeing how people kind of dealt with big life events during this time, right? Because you had, people that it was the beginning of wedding season and people had weddings that got canceled and, birthday parties, graduations, all sorts of things. And one of the things I noticed was how people got creative about trying to still have something. So people had online birthday parties. So people had weddings over Zoom. One of my favorite stories, I think it was in the Washington Post, this couple in Capitol Hill that obviously, their wedding got canceled because of COVID. They couldn't have the big wedding. And what happened was that their neighborhood, their block, threw them a wedding ceremony. And they had the officiant via Zoom, and everybody from the block did something for them. They decorated the sidewalks and they brought flowers and they cheered them on from their own front doors and celebrated their love. And obviously that wasn't the picture perfect wedding that the bride and the groom may have imagined, but it was a real wedding. And there was real love. We have this sense, a lot of us, that, life has to be ideal for it to matter. But it doesn't. For me, this time is interesting because the first Sunday that we had online-only church was actually the Sunday when I found out that my wife Megan was pregnant. So I'm never going to forget that day. And my number one memory about this time is particularly, the beginning of Megan's pregnancy. And I'm always going to think about, our future son and this time. Megan actually shared on Facebook a video of me finding out that she was pregnant. We're going to show it to you right now.
Go. Go see Juanito. Go. 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 Up, Colin.
Corey. Whoa. Oh my God, Corey, you look so adorable. You look so
Corey,
handsome.
up.
Corey,
Corey.
you look so handsome.
Corey, so hold it
Good
up.
boy. Good boy.
That video you just saw, it's probably like, for me at least, the first memory I have connected to the lockdown, which is kind of weird, like this has been a difficult time for sure, but for me there's also been like this sweetness and this joy of, the pregnancy journey. But it hasn't been perfect, right? Like I've only been able to listen to my son's heartbeat once because I'm not allowed anymore into the OBGYN office, so I can't go into the appointments. And it's difficult, and I'm sad that I miss that. It's not ideal, but this thing, that doesn't make it any less legitimate. My son's life, it's so very legitimate, so very real. It might not be ideal, the way in which we're living our lives, but it's not any less real. This is our lives, and we're called to embrace them. The final thing is this. In that passage, what we see is that God connects their flourishing and their building of a life in the midst of exile with the flourishing of others. Like the beginning of the passage is very inwardly, right? Like it's about them. It's like build houses and plant gardens and settle down and all these things. And then God kind of like turns it outwards and saying, but actually, you know what? It's only that you have to do that. I want you to engage these people around you with love. And I want you to seek the flourishing, to seek the prosperity, the welfare of the city in which you are. Now, that's ironic for a couple of reasons. One is, these are the people that took them into exile. These are not nice people. The last thing in the mind of the people of Jerusalem is to seek the prosperity of the city that took them into exile. But it's not only that. These people are destitute. They don't have anything anymore. They were powerful ones, but they're not anymore. All their property, all their power, it's gone. They're destitute exiles in Babylon, and yet God tells them there, you know how you're going to prosper when you seek the good of the people around you. And I think that there's something for us to learn, how our lives flourish, how we're able to rebuild our lives in the midst of exile. Well, when we seek the good of the people around us, when we seek the welfare of others. And God says, when you do that, when you become an instrument of blessing, that's when God blesses us. That's when God helps us start rebuilding our lives. There's this connection between how we live for others and the life that God rebuilds for us. Now, I don't think that this passage is only true and applicable for this particular time that we're living in. I actually think that it applies to the aftermath of any life-altering traumatic event. Be it the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one or the loss of a relationship, right? Like we find ourselves in these moments that we feel like the people of Israel, that we're like, how can we possibly, sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? How can I possibly imagine a future right now? How can I possibly imagine having a life after everything that's just happened to me? I cannot see a future. And friends, what I see in that passage is God looking at the life of Israel, but look also at our lives and also the things we've suffered and we've lost, and refusing to let whatever terrible loss we've experienced derail our lives forever. And it's God saying to them, and God saying to me and to you and to all of us, listen, in the midst of whatever it's happened to you, where you think you cannot possibly have a future, there you can rebuild your life. And not only any life, a good life. A life of flourishing, for I, declares the Lord, know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, the reason why we can believe that this is true for our lives is actually, believe it or not, connected to the story of Jesus. Because you see, the way the Bible works is that you have all these individual narratives, but they're all kind of like also designed to reflect the larger meta-narrative of the scriptures. So the people of Israel are in exile in Babylon, but at the same time that they're in exile in Babylon, they're also representing the fact that humanity is in exile from Eden. That there is this separation from the way in which God designed the world to work, from the shalom, the peace of God. And that's, forget COVID, like that's always been true, right? Take a look at the news right now. What we're seeing is that this is not the way the world was supposed to be. Like when we see the brokenness, the pain, the hate, the racism around us, all the things that we see, all the brokenness, the disease, the sickness, all that, this is not how things were supposed to be. So the story of Jesus, it's really a story of God sending his son into the world, into human history, to end exile. Like Jesus comes into the world to reconcile us to God so that we don't have to be exiled from God, exiled from Eden, from Shalom forever. One of the things that a lot of Bible scholars, talk about, like that psalm that we read and this passage in Jeremiah, is this idea that the people of Israel were probably kind of like living on the fringes of the city, right? Kind of like by the city gates or outside the city gates, not wanting to really get involved into the life of Babylon. And there's a passage in the book of Hebrews that says, that talks about Jesus, says this. It's Hebrews 13, verse 12 says, and so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is that Jesus in a way experiences the ultimate exile, right? Jesus, like going outside the city gates, is exiled from Jerusalem, exiled from his people. But in a way, he's also exiled from God. Like there's a passage that says that Jesus on the cross recites a psalm and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is experiencing that exile from God, that separation from God that sin causes, so that we can be reconciled to God. So that we can, when we place our faith in Christ, our lives are brought back into relationship with God. Our lives are reconciled. Exile ends for us. And this is true, obviously, in the entire narrative, right? Like, this is what it means to place our faith in Jesus, to believe that our lives are reconciled spiritually with God. But what you see through the Bible, even in the New Testament, is that it also has, an application to the day, to the, here and now. Like you see the church through the New Testament and then through history. And the church kind of like functions as a group of people in exile. Like that passage in Hebrews, actually, right after that, he says, well, now we should follow Jesus out of the city gates, right? Because we were not made for this city. We were made for the city to come. It's saying kind of like, what? God created us, for eternity, for the kingdom of God. But then he also says, well, while we're living here, we should seek to do good to the people around us. So as a church, we're kind of like in this space of exile. And the same invitation that was made to the people of Israel in Babylon in the book of Jeremiah, it's made to us, that we're here, and even in the midst of whatever situation, however difficult it may seem, however unideal it may seem, there God invites us to live lives of good and to seek the flourishing of others, and through that God will make our own lives flourish. That's the call of the church. Maybe you're listening to this today and you might not be a follower of Jesus, but what I want to tell you today is that that's an invitation for your life as well. That Jesus invites us and says, listen, in the midst of everything that you see around us, in the midst of whatever uncertainty you may look at in your own life right now, I have plans for you. And they're good plans. They're plans of hope. They're plans of a good future. And the invitation of Jesus is for you to step into that life, to believe in him, so that then our exile from God can also end. And if that you would love to help you through that, maybe just drop us a line in the comments or in the connection card. And we'd love to help you in this journey of following Jesus. And for the rest of us, the invitation is to live lives of hope. That in the midst of whatever's going on right now, to not just live in the past, in anger or bitterness for what we've lost, and not also only live in the future wishing that things would end, but that this here right now is where our lives are at. And this here right now is where God is seeking to bless the people around us through us. And for us to do that, we have to embrace this time and trust God and follow into that and build a life even in the midst of a difficult situation, even in the midst of an uncertain situation, even in the midst of exile. And there is where God meets us with good plans, with a hope and a future. Grace and peace.